Well, we'll be in Matthew chapter 2 this morning. Matthew chapter 2, starting right at verse 1. Before we get there, though, Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
It's 2018. 2018, here we go. Do you know 2017 is over now? And there's a lot of people that are happy about that. Have you noticed that? And you don't have to raise your hand, Mike. That's okay. A lot of people think 2017 was a crazy year. And it sort of was for us. It brought a lot of things that created a little bit of turmoil, a little bit of social conversation. We experienced maybe one of the most divisive political seasons, political campaigns, political elections here in the U.S. We made it. We experienced protests and riots. We had conversations about race and gender. We witnessed the ugliness of violence as well as the beauty of creation when we looked at that eclipse. 2017 was a crazy year. But I point us to remember that this morning because I think if we tune back into the mayhem of 2017, we might be able to understand the gospel reading a little bit better this morning. We need to remember that this is not the first time the world has been crazy. And so there's good news. And so let's turn our attention to what the gospel, the good news, has for us this morning. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, by no means are least among the rulers of Judea. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them exactly the time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So I mentioned earlier that we just entered a new season in the life of the church, the season we call Epiphany. Do you know what an epiphany is? Well, let's talk about what is the season of Epiphany. It's closely related to the season of Christmas that we just finished up, but it's a little bit different. It's the time of year that the church tunes in its attention to how God reveals God's self in the world. Do you know that we do not believe that we just have to guess at what God is like? You know that? We don't have to guess as what it's like to be in relationship with God. We believe that our God is a God who reveals himself through the person of Jesus, and that we get to be in close personal relationship with God. So this morning, as we look at this text in this season of Epiphany, the question we ask is, what do we learn about the way that God reveals God's self? And so, I want us to do that by looking at King Herod and drawing a contrast. Because Jesus, in verse 2, the Magi say he will be called the King of Israel. So there's a lot of kingship language in this text. We're hearing a lot about kings. We hear about King Herod, who's the king over Judea. We hear about the Magi. We sang "We Three Kings." We call them kings sometimes. And we hear about King Jesus. So I want us to look at these kings to draw some contrast and to see how maybe it would be that God would reveal God's self to us this morning. King Herod. King Herod was the king over Judea, that area in Palestine. He was appointed by the emperor of Rome. Do you know anything about Rome? Rome was conquering the world. And they had this saying that they would put on coins and everything, and it was this: peace through victory, which means, hey, let's live in peace together unless you do anything that I disagree with, and then I'm going to strike you down and you'll be dead, and then I won't have to deal with you. And that's how I'm going to make peace. And that was the way of Rome, peace through victory. And over Rome was the emperor, Caesar Augustus. And do you know what they said about Caesar? He was the Son of God. That's what they called him. Whenever he would have his image, there would be a saying under it, Son of God. And so, Rome has this message of peace through victory. The emperor is the greatest king who's called the Son of God. And the emperor appoints Herod over Judea to be this local king who will have authority over this area and who will report to the emperor. So Herod is in charge of the place in which Jesus is born. So what kind of king is King Herod? Well, we hear there in verse 3 that when he hears about this new king being born to be king over Israel, he's not too excited about it. Did you notice that? Verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. And do you know what he did? He said, hey, wise guys, come here. I want you to go and find the baby, and then when you find him, come and tell me, because I'm going to go worship him. Now, if we read past verse 12, we find out that's not the intent of his heart. We see that he lives according to peace through victory. In fact, he orders this great massacre, right? That all the children under the age of 2, all the male children, to be killed. Peace through victory. Now Herod's upset about this because if there's a king born and you're the king, well, that's not going to work out too well for one of you, right? And if the emperor hears that on Herod's watch a king has risen up for Israel and Israel's going to revolt against Rome, I don't think the emperor is going to be very happy with Herod. And so Herod needs to keep his position of authority. So what kind of king is Herod? He's disturbed. He's filled with hatred, with rage. And he lives according to the rules of Rome, peace through victory. And so, as we think about the way God reveals God's self in the world, the revelation this morning for us is found in the contrast. So, here is our epiphany for today. In a world of kings, God shows up as a baby. Did you hear that? In a world of kings, God shows up as a baby. In a world where kings say more power, more territory, more army, more me, more wealth, God shows up as a baby. So the very first time that humanity lays its eyes on God in the flesh, God is a small child. What might that mean? That God became a baby. A child, its nature is to love. Now, I know not always, but think of the sweet moments, okay? When you're holding a child. They have a great capacity to love, and to love very quickly, and very openly, and very freely, to offer love. They trust, don't they? A baby doesn't know anything but trust at the beginning. And a baby is often filled with great joy at very small what we might often think of as insignificant things: love, trust, and joy. And we see that contrast with King Herod, who is filled with hatred, with fear, and with self-consuming desire for power. So I saw this Verizon commercial on television. And the whole point of it is there are these famous athletes: LeBron James, Drew Brees, and Adriana Lima, who's an actress. And they're talking to kids. And LeBron James says, "We don't need any more LeBrons." And Drew Brees says, who's the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, he says, "We don't need any more Drews." And Adriana, who's an actor, says, "We don't need any more Adrianas." And so Verizon is offering to children, hey, there are these awesome kind of places of recognition, but we have enough of those. What we need is people who are going to really sink their teeth into math and science. That's where the future is. That's where the economy is going to be built. And so Verizon has put out this ad to encourage kids to study math and science, to become engineers, to become computer technicians. And so they say, we don't need any more LeBrons. We don't need any more Drews. We don't need any more Adrianas. Well, I want to say to you this morning, the solution to the craziness is not another king. We do not need more kings. The world does not need another king. What we need is a baby. What we need is infancy, trust, love, and joy. So, 2017 was a crazy year, as many other years before it have been. But in the midst of our power-hungry systems, God reveals a better way to be in the world. A baby. That's good news for me. A lot of people say I have a baby face, so I can pull that off. There's a better way to be in the world. That's why we love the story of the Magi. That's why we love to sing We Three Kings. That's why we love to set up our nativity and put the wise men right there in the stable bowing before the infant Jesus. Because in the picture of those three kings, those Magi, those foreigners, those people from the east, we see in them kings bowing before the one true king, who is a baby. That's why we love that story, because we know deep within ourselves that the way to be in the world is not another crown or another throne, but it's a manger. And that is how God reveals God's self first, as a baby. And so these wise men, these Magi, these three kings, they see a star and they follow it. And I want to encourage you this morning to be on the watch for where you might see a star appearing in your world, so that you might be led to kneel before Christ, who is an infant. So that's why we see value in telling their story, because we are reminded that God is revealed first as a baby. I've never been to Rome. I would love to someday. But in the Vatican, the Pope a long time ago, in 1508, invited a great artist, Michelangelo, to come and to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And so if you were to go today and look, you would see all these wonderful stories of the Bible brought to life. First, one of the most famous is the creation of Adam. You might not know it by its name, but have you ever seen the picture of God reaching out with his finger and Adam reaching up with his finger, and their fingers are almost touching? Have you seen that picture before? Well, it's a wonderful picture, and I couldn't do any better. But I have a bone to pick with Michelangelo, and there's not any use arguing with him right now, I understand that, but we tend to get maybe in a rut of seeing God in the way that we see God in this picture, and this is how God is pictured: a long flowing robe. He's an old white man with long white hair and a long white beard. And I'm not saying that's a bad image for us to use for God, but I'm just saying that it's not the only image that we might use to understand how God reveals God's self. And so this morning I want to invite us to ask the question, what might happen if we learn to receive this morning God as an infant? If we reflect on the picture of Christ that we see in the gospel of Jesus as a baby, what might God say to us if God comes to us in that way? And how might we experience God differently if we are reminded that God first reveals God's self as an infant? I remember several years ago when I was still in college, I was invited to a church on our district to speak and fill in for a pastor to preach that morning. And so I showed up. The church was kind of a new church. It was in a strip mall, and it was smaller than the room we're gathered in right now. And there was probably 25, 30 people, and I knew a few of them, but most people there were strangers. And their music team was up singing, and I was standing there preparing to preach and kind of just trying to get ready, be in the right moment. And I remember these guys came in late to the service. And I thought, wow, they're here late. Now, this isn't a story that's going to make me look good, so let me just say that, okay? This is a story about your pastor being a human. And they just looked trashy. They didn't look like they had a clue where they were showing up to. They looked like the last kind of people you would expect to be walking into church that morning. And I thought, this sermon's going to go right over their heads. They're not going to get this at all. They're rough, tough-looking guys. And the Lord invited me to see something that I've never been able to shake. I don't know those guys. I couldn't even pick them out of a lineup. I don't know their stories. But I imagined one of them sitting in a chair, and I imagined that he had a daughter that was only this tall. And despite whatever his story was, or whatever he had done that week, wherever he had gone, his little girl running up, jumping into her dad's lap, putting her hands on his face and saying, "I love you, Papa. I love you." And I realized in that moment, sometimes God can only be revealed to us as a young child, as an infant, as a baby. And so Michelangelo, he's painted this great painting of God as this older man with this big flowing beard, and there might be some value in that. But the image of God that has captivated me is this picture of this little girl who loves her papa just because it's her papa. So this morning, I'm going to invite us to do something we've probably never done before, most of us, but we're just going to imagine together, to let the Lord speak to us. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. Center yourself. And I want you to imagine this morning that you're holding a little child. Now, this child wouldn't be able to rule a kingdom, might not have many skills, might not even be able to speak yet. But the baby is looking up at you, and there's a smile. I want you to think, how does this child feel about me? Doesn't matter where you've been or what you've done. The child loves you and trusts you and is filled with joy to be held by you. And that, my friends, my family, is our epiphany this morning. That God feels the exact same way as that child. God puts God's arms around you and says, I love you because I love you. Lord, we're thankful that we don't have to guess at who you are, but that you reveal yourself to us. So, Lord, this morning I'm asking that you would help us to receive you as a child, to receive you as an infant, to receive you as a baby in a manger. And may the love and trust and joy pierce our hearts, melt away our hatred, our fear, and our self-consuming desire, and make us into the image of Christ. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. Amen. Now receive this benediction. May you go from this place into a world of kings in the way of God. May you be like an infant, trusting, loving, joyful, so that others might also see the star of Christ in you, and may you always go in peace. Amen.